I wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered today. We pay our respects to the local people for allowing us to have gathering on their land, and to their elders past, present, and future. Hi, my name is Caleb Casley, and I'm one of the white people living in Australia. I'm a terrible drawer, so hopefully you can understand what I'm trying to get across. Growing up living in rural Victoria and going to a Catholic primary school, I was always taught about the Aboriginal communities in Australia and how that they were here before Captain Cook discovered it. We would always do an acknowledgement of country of the traditional owners of the land. This had me thinking, what exactly happened to this group of people? Moving into high school, a Catholic high school, we would continue to be taught about Aboriginal history, from the massacres of the Aboriginal people to the stolen generation to land rights and education rights. It is fair to say that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have had it rough, and I have learnt that even though something happens in the past, it can still affect someone in the future. So by saying, forget about it, it is all in the past, you are taking away their right. You can't just forget something that has happened to you, especially since it has been affecting the Aboriginal community for generations, and nor should they have to. All we can do is help them in the future and help strengthen our relationship with them and say sorry for what was done in the past. No, we can't change the past, but we can sure make the future bright. Now, before I started this unit, I knew a little about the stolen generation, but I have now increased my knowledge on the subject. When the Europeans arrived in Australia and discovered that the land was already occupied, they weren't impressed, and they couldn't go around and kill them all, although they did try. They introduced the assimilation policy to rid Australia of the Aboriginal community. This was done through selective breeding and the removal of Aboriginal children that could pass off as white. There were many acts and legislations that resulted in the removal of children from their Aboriginal families. This was the Aborigines Protection Act. This act gave the Aborigines Protection Board the power to assume full custody of the child of any Aboriginal family if deemed unfit as parents. These children were known as the stolen generation. In 1969, all states have revoked the legislation allowing for the removal of Aboriginal children under the policy of protection. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made a historical national apology to the stolen generation, which is the first acknowledgement and apology of the stolen generation, which is almost 100 years when the Aborigines Protection Act came into play. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss on these, our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities, and their country. For the pain, suffering, and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind, we say sorry. From all this, I have seen a few references of Aboriginal history being shown in Australian film, and being a little movie geek, I really appreciate what these movies have done to acknowledge events that happened in the past, like the stolen generation. The two movies that I enjoyed the most, and I feel really showed the harsh conditions being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, are The Sapphires and The Rabbit Proof Fence. The Sapphires is a movie that was released in 2012 that is set in 1969 and is about four Indigenous Australian women who were discovered by a talent scout for their incredible singing. Together they form a music group known as the Sapphires. This movie is based on a true story and talks about the obstacles they have to overcome as Aboriginal people in a country that had only just given them the right to vote. This movie touches on the stolen generation where one of the members of the group, Kai, who had been living in Melbourne for 10 years after the government took her from her family because she was half white. In it, you can see a flashback where in their little community on the outskirts of town, the children are playing, then government cars come and all the children are told to run and hide because they don't want to be taken. Another film about the stolen generation is titled The Rabbit Proof Fence, released in 2002. It follows three young girls whom are taken from their home and put into settlements for half-caste servants and labourers. Shocked at the situation, the girls flee in the night and head back home. To get home, they follow the rabbit-proof fence in Western Australia, but they are hunted along their journey home. This is another example where the film industry has recognised what was done to the Aboriginal community during the time of the stolen generations and what harsh conditions they were put into. Thinking about what happened in the past, I cannot even begin to imagine how this has impacted the Aboriginal community for generations. I can't even imagine what it is like to be taken away from my family. I have heard stories from people whom were a part of the stolen generation and their journeys to finding their families and reuniting with them. Aside from children getting stolen, children were also unable to get a proper education because they weren't allowed in schools. Everyone deserves a right to an education, and Aboriginal children have been denied this since the colonisation of Australia. Most children don't enjoy school too much. I know I didn't, but when I started learning what I was interested in, I was excited for it and ready to learn. Before the colonisation of Australia, the Aboriginal communities had a different way of educating their children. Information was given when they felt that the children was ready to receive it. There were tutors who ensured that history and the essentials of life were taught. One of the most important processes used in education was to cultivate powers of observation. Education is very important in today's society, and everyone deserves the right to an education. In 1967, the federal government released a referendum that empowered the government to address Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's right to an education. This started the first step into making Australia become more inclusive and recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as people. In 1972, the Department of Aboriginal Affairs officially stopped the practice of principals refusing enrolment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in state schools, which then led to the introduction of Aboriginal Teachers' Age, which not only improves student attendance, but also their educational outcomes. It is great to learn that over time, Aboriginal people were slowly but surely being recognised as a group of people and taking ownership of what was done to them in the past, and helping to be inclusive. The Aboriginal education policy acknowledged the need for self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to develop a more appropriate pedagogy, including the need for schools to develop relationships of equity with local and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The policy also stressed the importance for students and teachers to be provided with adequate resources to understand the value of Aboriginal culture in Australia. In 1987, it became mandatory for schools to incorporate Aboriginal studies into the curriculum with a focus on culture and history to improve cross-cultural understanding. Although it was mandatory, schools with fewer Aboriginal students saw it as irrelevant and often overlooked this requirement. This seems to be an unnecessary predicament. I went to two schools that no Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders attended. Well, not that I know of, but we were still required to learn about it, because whether we like it or not, it is part of our Australian history. With this new education policy, the federal government are showing the whole community that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have a separate culture from white society, and we as a society need to be open and welcoming to this culture that has been part of this country for many years. As a nation, we are accepting that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are part of this nation, and that Australian history before European settlement is just as significant, if not more so. It is great to see how far we have come as a nation, and although what we have done in the past was horrible and sadistic, we are amending it today to make the world a more inclusive place for everyone. This is my favourite part of Aboriginal culture, Dreamtime stories. Tell the stories of how the ancestor spirits created the land and everything in it. I thought I would tell a story today and try and illustrate it all for you. Tiddalik the Frog. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago in the Dreamtime, there was a greedy frog called Tiddalik. Tiddalik wanted to be the biggest frog in all the land. One very hot day, Tiddalik was very thirsty, so he began to drink and drink and drink until the whole billabong was all dried up. When all the other animals came to the billabong to drink, there was no water. They knew it was the greedy frog who drank it all. They were very angry at him. If the animals wanted to get all the water out of Tiddalik and back into the billabong, they would have to make Tiddalik laugh until all the water came out. The echidna tried to make him laugh by rolling down the hill into the dried up billabong, but Tiddalik didn't laugh. Kookaburras perched high in the gum tree. He pretended to fall out, but Tiddalik still didn't laugh. Wombat started dancing, but Tiddalik still didn't laugh. None of the animals knew what to do, and they were still very thirsty. When the snake was dancing, he tied himself into a big knot. Tiddalik could not stop laughing at the snake. He laughed so much that all the water came out and ran back into the billabong. From that day on, Tiddalik was never greedy and only drank what he needed. Every Dreamtime story has a meaning behind it, or a message that is what I love about them. From what I got from the story of Tiddalik is that sharing is important, and these stories are a great way to teach children about morals and ethics. I have found that over the past couple of months, my knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has been further developed, and I have a greater understanding and appreciation for the Aboriginal community. They have overcome so many hurdles in life, and they have come a long way. I also think the white Australian community has come far when it comes to accepting the community and acknowledging our past with them, even how horrific it is. I want to try my best to help the community out so we can all live together as one nation.